The comms were jammed. Dust masked every thermal return. The convoy staggered in the open while officers circled maps that no longer matched the ground. Orders clashed. Satellites lagged. A drone fed back partial movement. Then nothing. Marin stayed by the signal repeater. Half out of frame. Forgotten under her headset, she adjusted the filter one notch past protocol. The ridge wasn't clear. It was curved. She tapped once, marked the slope, and rerouted fire by 3 degrees. No one saw her move, but when the ridge lit up, the ambush missed by 20 meters. It was enough. Reese parked her truck at the edge of the gravel lot, far from the other vehicles. The old concrete plant they were rehabbing loomed ahead, still half-skinned with scaffolding and torn tarps. It was early enough that her breath hung in the air, vanishing before it reached the open bay doors. She killed the engine, let her hand rest on the steering wheel, then reached across the seat for her work gloves. The dash light glinted off the worn metal of the multi-tool lying in the tray by the shifter. She picked it up, ran her thumb once along the edge, then slipped it into her back pocket. No one spoke when she walked in. The job didn't require small talk. Reese clocked in, took her clipboard, and moved toward the southeast corner, where the conduit cages were half finished. Someone had left the wire runs sloppy. She crouched, adjusted the leveling brackets, and began unthreading the whole mess with the calm patience of someone who knew time was measured differently for her. A younger guy in a hoodie nodded at her from across the space. She returned nothing, not out of rudeness. There was just nothing she needed to say. Her motions were methodical. Left glove tucked tight under her palm. Right wrist braced. She worked the cabling clean. Even where someone else had stripped the sheathing too shallow, when her cutter stuck, she didn't yank. She rotated once, shifted pressure, and freed it on the second pass. Nothing rushed. Nothing wasted. By mid-morning, the others were shouting over the clatter of scaffolding brackets and pushing each other toward the coffee truck. Reese stayed on her line. She tied off the final section, double-checked her runs, and returned the tools to her pouch in reverse order. One of the foremen called out from the upper deck, saying they could use another set of hands on the western stairwell. She looked up, gave a half nod, and shifted course without a word. That's how she moved through most days. Straight lines. Soft boots. Corners tightened and tools cleaned at the end of shift. Her name didn't float in conversation, but her work did. Someone always pointed out her cuts were level. Her trenching never ran short of code. Still, she was never invited for drinks, never asked if she was prior service. It was easier that way. The apartment she rented was above a feed store 2 towns over. It was 1 bedroom. Bare drywall. Low ceiling. No pictures. 1 metal rack held her boots, hard hat, and folded flannels. The kitchenette smelled faintly of dust and plastic wrap. She didn't decorate it, didn't play music. Her evening ritual followed the same pace as her worksite routine. Jacket hung square. Boots cleaned, not scrubbed. Tools lined up on a mat beside the wall. She always laid the multi-tool last. The multi-tool had traveled with her through 3 deployments. The hinge pin had been replaced once. One side still bore a blackened crease from an engine bay fire outside Mosul. The wire stripper was dull, but she knew the exact angle it needed to cut clean. She never called it sentimental. It just belonged to the kind of work that made sense. You hold it. You fix something. You move on. The nights stretched out quietly. She made tea without sugar. Saturday, at the table without ever turning on the overhead light. If there were dreams, she didn't name them. If her breathing changed, she didn't check the clock. The ceiling fan hummed in a slow rhythm, the same way the generators used to thrum through the floor under her cot, steady enough to remind her she hadn't drifted too far. One weekend, the job ran overtime. She was the only one who showed without being called. The western stairs needed reinforcement brackets. The schematic was old, misaligned from the demolition plan. She spent 3 hours mapping the steel runs by hand, measuring twice, marking stud points with chalk and grease pencil. She spoke to no one. She carried the bracket plates one at a time. She locked each one down with even pressure, bolt by bolt, until the seams held flush. By the time the others returned Monday, the section was done. No one asked who finished it. The foreman just checked the box and nodded. Reese folded her chalk line, pressed it flat, and slid it back into her vest. Then she turned back to conduit. The wind shifted that afternoon, pushing dust from the north scaffold into the main bay. One of the new hires cursed as grit caught in his eyes. Reese pulled her collar up without a word. She saw the ladder angle lean 3 degrees off, where it shouldn't have, and her body adjusted to catch the top rung. She didn't miss steps. She didn't ask for help. But her grip paused for just a breath longer than usual. Her jaw set tight. It passed. She kept climbing. Later that week, as she pulled into the lot before dawn, she noticed the lights were already on. Someone had beat her to sight. Unusual. She parked in the same spot anyway, reached for her gloves, and paused when she saw the multi-tool sitting in the tray. She picked it up, flipped it open, and checked the blade. Clean, sharp enough to hold. But something in her chest shifted no harder than a breath against frost. She slid it into her pocket and stepped out into the cold. She didn't know what had changed, only that something had. Reese found the notice folded once inside a grocery flyer left wedged into the apartment doorframe. She almost missed it. The paper crinkled sharply when she bent it open. One black and white photo. Standard issue. The name beneath it stopped her hand mid-fold. It was him. Jacob Flores. She stared at it. Not because she hadn't expected to see a name like that again, but because the font was too casual, the layout too thin. Just a column. No details beyond service years, and a short line about surviving parents. No mention of the war. No medals. No unit. She read the line about the service time. Friday, 11 in the morning. A church she didn't know. Just outside town. She tore the flyer in half along the crease and folded the obituary again. Smaller, until it fit between her fingers. Then she slid it into the inside panel of her vest without thinking. The site was quiet that day. Most of the crew had been pulled for a foundation pour across the river. Reese called in sick for the first time since being hired. She didn't explain, just said she wouldn't be on shift. No one asked questions. The church sat back from the road. Brick sides dull with weather. The parking lot cracked with weeds. She parked 3 rows away from the nearest car and waited until the hour turned. No one spoke as she entered. The pews were mostly empty. A few older couples sat near the back. One man with an army pin nodded at her and looked away. No uniforms. No folded flags. The casket was closed. She stayed standing until the service began, then sat near the far edge, against the wall. Her boots made no sound on the floor. A woman 2 rows ahead caught her eye once lean. Posture like a coil, half released, hair pulled into a low knot. She wasn't crying either. Her hands were still, but her gaze never left the pulpit. Reese recognized something in her jaw. The way it locked slightly when the minister mispronounced the middle name. That was the only moment she blinked. The service lasted 19 minutes. No eulogy. Just verses and a short prayer. No one in the pews spoke. No one rose to say anything. Afterward, Reese stepped out into the light without pausing at the casket. She passed the woman again. This time their eyes met, only briefly. Nothing theatrical. Just a flicker of acknowledgement between people who carried the same unspoken inventory. Then Reese moved on. She drove back with the windows cracked, wind pulling against her collar. the folded paper still pressing against her chest. Back at the apartment, she dropped her boots outside the door, washed her hands for too long, and set her tools on the counter instead of the rack. She stared at them like they didn't belong there. The next morning she was late to site, only by 10 minutes. But late. One of the foremen noticed and raised a brow. Reese nodded once, said traffic, and moved past. Her tools felt heavier. Her grip wasn't looser. Just delayed. When she cut wire that morning, she had to mark the same line twice. At break, she sat in her truck and took out the obituary. The paper had softened at the fold. She traced one corner with her thumb, smoothing it flat across her leg. Her eyes didn't sting. She hadn't spoken to Jacob in over 5 years. He'd been part of another rotation, another stretch of desert, another bridge to be built. He made jokes at Chow and once gave her a clean socket when hers cracked mid-shift. That was the whole memory. No big moments. No medals exchanged. Just tools passed between hands. Still, something lodged behind her ribs and refused to leave. That night, she didn't eat. Just turned the water on and let it run until the steam filled the tiny kitchen. She sat in the dark with her vest still on, the paper crinkling when she shifted. She didn't cry, didn't speak, but her shoulders ached the way they used to after hours under the blast blanket. The weight wasn't from grief exactly. It was the shape of something that didn't want to be named. She left the paper folded in the side pocket, didn't throw it away, didn't reread it, just kept it there, creasing more every time she moved. For the rest of the week, her steps were a little slower. Her corners still held, her lines still ran true, but she double-checked things she usually trusted on the first pass. She kept the multi-tool in her pocket longer, thumbing the hinge, like it might tell her something. And sometimes, when she passed a window or a truck mirror, she caught herself looking not at her own face, but for that woman again, the one at the funeral. She didn't know her name, but she remembered her eyes, and the way they locked quiet, flat, but unshaken. That was the part that stayed. The scrapyard wasn't far from the old rail spur, just a sagging chain-link gate, a line of rusted vehicles slouched in the dirt, and a corrugated garage tucked into the corner like it didn't want attention. Reese had pulled in without thinking, coasting past the scattered piles of stripped metal until she saw the figure kneeling beside an old engine cradle near the back wall. The light from the single halogen pole flickered in low, uneven bands. It was almost dark. Lana didn't look up right away. She had a breaker bar locked in at a 45. Shoulder braced. Foot steady. The engine block shifted once, then gave with a low metallic groan. She wiped the edge of her knuckle on her jeans and finally glanced up. Her face didn't register surprise, just a nod. Same as someone might give passing a truck they used to drive. Reese said she'd been told they might have some leftover conduit she could trade for. Lana pointed toward a bin near the back. No smile. No questions? Reese moved slow. Boots quiet over the packed gravel. Eyes scanning the rows of disassembled motors and stripped wiring looms. The conduit was there. Bent. Maybe salvageable? She picked through the pile with practiced fingers. One end still held a jagged cuff where someone had sawn it wrong. She pulled it anyway. You know how to flare that clean. Lana's voice carried low. Steady. Reese didn't answer immediately. She just ran her thumb down the edge. Tested the give. Then she replied, I've done worse with less. That was all. Lana went back to the engine. They didn't speak again for 20 minutes. Reese stayed, sorting pieces onto the bed of her truck, stacking them in parallel, matching diameters without glancing down. Lana moved around the hoist with that same quiet precision, every motion functional. Nothing wasted. They didn't ask each other names, didn't bring up the church. Later, As the air cooled and the bugs began to hum along the edges of the fence line, Reese circled back toward the garage. Lana stood at the workbench, taping a cracked wire harness with black wrap. Each turn, even and close. Reese hesitated, then gestured toward the coil. Wrong gauge for that system. Lana gave a half shrug. I know. It's what I've got. Reese held out a section from her own bin. Try this. Lana took it, their hands brushing faintly. Nothing lingered. The tape resumed. A few minutes passed like that. No music. No background chatter. Just the sound of crickets rising with the dark and the faint rustle of metal cooling in the open air. Reese reached for a socket extension at one point, found her hand brushing the one Lana had already slid forward. You always this quiet? Lana asked. Not mocking. Just factual. Reese nodded once. Easier that way. Lana didn't push. She turned the light on over the work table. It clicked once. Hummed. And stayed. By then, Reese had settled into a rhythm too, cutting back the conduit ends with a handsaw from her truck, brushing off rust, rethreading one section with care. It didn't matter if she used it. The work was the point. Lana leaned back against the side wall, hands finally still. Her voice came keener now, shaped by thought, but not weightless. He called me, she said. Reese didn't look up, but her hands slowed. Lana didn't clarify who. She didn't have to. Didn't say much. Lana continued. Just that he didn't want to be heavy anymore. The silence held for several seconds. Reese set down the pipe she'd been holding. The metal rang faintly on the tailgate. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away. Lana glanced down at her keys resting beside the wire spools. A single dog tag hung beside the ignition fob, clean, unmarked. No chain. Just there. Reese saw it but didn't ask. They both stood still for a minute. The light buzzed above them. Somewhere across the lot, a truck backfired faintly on the highway. The night pressed in cool around the edges, softening everything into shadow. Eventually, Reese picked up the last section of conduit, tied it down with 2 bands, and moved to close the tailgate. She paused before lifting it, her eyes landing briefly on the unclaimed tag. Then on Lana's steady frame. I'll bring the cutter back next time, she said. Voice low. Lana nodded. Doesn't matter when. Reese didn't thank her. Didn't smile. She climbed into the cab, turned the engine once, and sat with her hands on the wheel for a breath longer than usual. She drove off slow, gravel crunching behind her, taillights washing the fence in red for half a second before vanishing. Neither of them had asked a single personal thing. Neither had said goodbye. But the weight in the air hadn't dropped. It had just shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly from one pair of shoulders to 2. The first time Reese followed Lana to the garage, it was still light out. The building was set back behind a shuttered welding shop, half hidden by a collapsed chain-link fence and a line of stubborn scrub trees. It looked more like a storage unit than a gathering place. But as Lana unlocked the padlock and pushed open the roll-up door, Reese saw the faint outlines of benches, socket sets, a floor jack, and at least 3 incomplete machines parked nose out like they were waiting for inspection. The air smelled like oil, dry metal, and faint detergent. Not clean, but cared for. Lana didn't explain anything. She just stepped inside, nodded once toward the far side of the garage, and began unwinding a drop light from the ceiling beam. Another woman was already there, mid-40s. Sleeves rolled, deep crease across her brow that didn't soften even when she looked up. She offered Reese a small nod and handed over a wrench like they were already in the middle of a job. By the time the 4th bolt came loose, Reese had found a rhythm. No introductions, no handshakes, just motion. The tools were old, but maintained. Nothing sparkled, but nothing rattled either. There were cabinets labeled in grease pencil and a cracked radio that only played country above static. Someone handed Reese a rag when her palms got slick. No one asked her about the army. She came back the next Friday. Then again the week after that. She didn't say she would. She didn't have to. The women rotated in and out, always the same kind of presence, steady, precise. Familiar in the way of people who've spent hours tuning something no one else noticed. One worked HVAC. Another was studying to certify as a welder. They didn't trade stories. They traded gloves, drill bits, and advice about torque ratios. One woman used a prosthetic grip with a rotating wrist. She cut pipes straighter than anyone Reese had ever worked with. Reese found herself bringing small things, a strip of LED task lights, an old vice grip she'd cleaned and re-greased. No one asked where she got them, but they found a place. The space never got warmer. Not even with the bodies. The heater in the corner wheezed, but never fully delivered. So they worked in layers, sleeves rolled or hoods pulled. Depending on the job. The windows stayed closed. The radio played low, conversation stayed lower. One night, while rotating tires on an old Harley rebuild, Lana mentioned a building she'd driven past, VFW off the access road. She said, while holding a socket brace steady, empty, roof's gone soft. Someone grunted and asked, "Why would we need a roof?" Lana didn't answer right away. She just tapped the lug nut with the flat end of a driver. Might be nice to have a space. No one called it a plan, but a week later, they stood outside the rust-stained cinder block building, staring at the tilted signage and the weeds curling up through the steps. Reese walked the perimeter once and pointed out that the western drain line was half collapsed. Lana nodded. Another woman said the studs looked dry inside. Just warped. Someone had already pulled the copper. Of course. They started small. Reese brought tools from her site kit. A few of them worked jobs that gave access to leftover supplies, half-used buckets of sealant, old breaker panels, sealed boxes of wire. There was no schedule, just momentum. Sometimes only 2 showed up, sometimes 6. They stripped the floor, cleared the old bathroom debris, and patched drywall where they could. The roof leak was harder. Reese climbed up without being asked, tested the membrane with her foot, and marked where the soft pitch gave way to rot. The breaker box was found inside a storage closet, rusted shut and coated with dust. Lana unscrewed it slowly, each turn releasing another layer of grime. The inside was worse fused breakers, water damage, 2 fire-warped terminals. Reese examined it with a tilt of her head, then walked back to her truck. She returned with a wire brush and a half roll of Romex. For the next 2 hours, they didn't speak. The wire stripped clean, the terminals were scrubbed, retensioned, reset. A replacement faceplate was scrounged from the garage stash. Reese cleaned every contact, wiping them with the care usually reserved for rifle parts. Lana managed the feed lines. Another woman tested the ground. When it was ready, no one said anything. Reese reached for the main and flipped the switch. The lights didn't flash. They just came on. Soft. Uneven. One of the fixtures in the far corner buzzed. Another blinked twice and steadied. The room filled with low yellow light, warm against the concrete and patched walls. No one clapped. No one spoke. But they all looked at it, just for a moment longer than needed. Then someone adjusted her grip on the broom handle and swept up the wire trimmings. Lana rolled her shoulder, stretched her neck, and went to check the outlet line. That night, Reese sat in her truck for a full minute before starting it. She looked down at her hands, still gray at the knuckles, and brushed them off on her pants without much effect. The dashboard light clicked on when she turned the key. She didn't drive away right away. Just let the engine idle. Her vest smelled like drywall and solder. Her knees ached faintly from kneeling too long on concrete. She didn't mind. She hadn't said much that evening. None of them had. But when the breaker box snapped shut and the light held, something in her chest had exhaled. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. The building still leaked in places. The roof wasn't fixed yet. The front door stuck. But the lights worked, and that was enough. The city inspector had come by mid-morning, clipboard in hand. Badge, visible but casual. He'd poked around the siding, eyed the roofline, and lingered too long near the breakers they'd rewired last month. His boots left dry impressions on the steps as he walked back to his truck and said it flatly. The structure might not meet code, might need to be torn down if it couldn't be documented or retrofitted to current standards. He wasn't rude, just indifferent. Reese didn't respond right away, just nodded once, watched him drive off, then walked back inside. The dust in the air caught the light like quiet fallout. She spent the next 2 days pulling records from the courthouse annex, digging through permit filings, and drafting retroactive schematics from memory. No one had asked her to. She didn't ask for help. By Thursday, she was back on site long after the others had gone. The main room was quiet. The overheads off. She worked by portable light, the kind that ran warm and threw shadows at odd angles. The air was cold enough that her breath fogged against the back wall. The beam above the entry was 2 degrees off from level, not enough to threaten collapse, but enough to catch a red mark from inspection. Reese had pulled the brackets out twice already. She kept her left boot braced against the baseboard while she drove the bolts again straight. Even. Tight. Except this time, her hand didn't hold steady. The socket slipped, not far, just enough to skip the track and knock against the washer. She paused, flexed her fingers, and tried again. Still shaky, not uncontrollable, just wrong. She sat back on her heels, pressing her hands flat against her thighs. Her breathing stayed even, but her jaw clenched harder. With each slow inhale, she looked toward the fuse box in the corner, eyes catching on the one line she hadn't replaced. That box controlled the external light, the one mounted above the back door, the one that had never come on. She stood slowly, knees stiff. Her hands brushed against the cinder block wall as she steadied herself. She crossed the floor, stepped over the coiled extension cord, and opened the panel. The old fuse was still there. It was fine, but she didn't trust it. She reached for her pocket. The new fuse rested in her hand like a coin with weight behind it. The old one came free with a faint crack of resistance. Her fingertips slipped on the first try. She wiped her palm on her jeans and tried again. This time, it gave. Behind her, the front door opened. The creak was soft, familiar. Lana stepped inside, hands in her jacket pockets. She didn't speak immediately, just stood in the doorway, eyes adjusting. Then she walked toward the edge of the floor, stopping short of the panel. You don't have to carry all of it. Her voice was quiet. Not a correction, just there. Reese didn't look at her, just stared at the new fuse. Then said, I don't know how not to. It wasn't angry. It wasn't weak. Just honest. Lana didn't reply. She didn't need to. Reese slid the fuse into place. The socket sparked once. She closed the panel and walked to the door. Outside, the motion light above the exit clicked. It didn't buzz. It didn't flicker. It came on. A clean white beam spilled over the concrete stoop, catching on the patch of gravel they'd cleared weeks ago. The light held steady. No one clapped. No one exhaled in relief. They just stood there a moment longer than they needed to. Then Lana said she'd lock up. Reese nodded once and stepped out into the cold. Her hands were still shaking. but less. Enough to find the truck keys without fumbling. She didn't drive away right away. Just sat. Engine off. Watching the light stay on. It was enough. The new paint on the front door had already chipped once near the latch. Lana said it gave the place character. Reese just sanded the edge and touched it up the next day. The building didn't try to be anything more than it was. The patched ceiling no longer sagged. The heaters worked without rattling. The lights stayed on. Inside, the smell of solder and drywall had faded into something warmer old wood. Brewed coffee. Vorn denim. The couches were mismatched and creaked when you sat down. The mugs didn't match either, but the coffee stayed hot, and the kettle never went empty. A pegboard ran along the side wall now, lined with tools they didn't bother labeling. Everyone knew what belonged where. A folding table in the back held spare fuses, socket sets, a tin of electrical tape, and a stained instruction manual for a generator no one actually used. The breaker box sat sealed in its frame, light humming above it, every switch labeled by hand. Reese arrived early. Most days, she didn't announce it, just walked in, pulled her gloves from the hook by the door, and started working on whatever needed doing. Sometimes it was cabinet hinges, sometimes pipe insulation, sometimes nothing at all. The others came in waves. Lana most mornings, carrying a half-eaten breakfast wrap, and always 2 tools short. Deanna came after night shifts, too tired to speak but always steady when handed something to fix. The woman with the prosthetic wrist, whose name turned out to be Erica, now kept a tool roll in the shared cabinet and reorganized the fastener bins when the rest of them forgot. Nobody ran things. Nobody asked permission. The new girl came on a Tuesday. Slim frame, cropped hair, eyes that didn't quite focus when she walked in. She wore boots too clean for this place, shoulders too tight. Lana had met her at a supply co-op, said she was looking for work. Maybe shelter. Definitely a place to land. She hovered by the entryway, holding a canvas satchel like she wasn't sure if she was expected to empty it or hold it tighter. Reese looked up from the panel she was sealing. The room didn't go quiet. It was already quiet. Reese stood, wiped her hands on her thigh, and walked over. She didn't say welcome. She didn't ask anything. She just gestured toward the tool bench. The tape's on the left, she said. Voice steady. Wire brushes under the shelf. The girl nodded slowly, glanced at the workbench, and stepped forward. That was all it took. Later, they were both crouched over a heater grate, brushing rust and tapping at the bolts. Reese didn't offer tips. The girl didn't ask questions. The sound of brushing, clicking metal, and soft boot steps filled the room. At some point, Erica passed them a small screwdriver and a packet of thermal pads. The girl said thanks. Quiet. Automatic. Reese glanced at her hands. Still steady. When the grate came loose, they set it aside and cleaned the sill in silence. Then Reese stood and went to get a vacuum, leaving the girl with the tool roll still unzipped. In the kitchen corner, Diana leaned against the counter, sipping coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug. She didn't speak either, just nodded once toward the new face and smiled. The kind that said she'd seen that look before. The day went on. Projects rotated. Reese rechecked the south fuse line. Lana argued gently with the wall outlet again. Erica rewired a desk lamp someone had dropped off last week. By sunset, the outpost had cooled into that gentle quiet that came with late work and nothing left to prove. The light softened across the floor. The girl had unpacked a socket wrench and slid it into the shared pegboard. Without being told, Reese walked over to the small storage shelf near the back, the one where they kept the things that didn't belong to anyone but were used by all. She reached into her vest pocket, felt the familiar weight press against her fingers. The multi-tool was still there. Scratched casing, dulled blade, wire stripper with a faint nick on one edge. She had carried it through 3 deployments, tightened bolts with it in blackout, cut line when the field kits jammed, rewired lights on an airfield in the middle of a dust storm, one hand shielding her eyes, the other gripping that handle like it was part of her own wrist. She held it a moment longer, thumb brushing the hinge. Then she set it down on the shelf. Not buried, not displayed, just placed. The girl was watching, not directly, just enough to notice. Reese didn't explain. She just turned, nodded once, and moved toward the outlet. Lana was still cursing. The multi-tool stayed. The room held. Reese never asked to be noticed. She didn't speak much, didn't explain herself, and never stepped forward to take credit. But she showed up, again and again, through noise, through silence, through the weight of memory that never quite let go. She built something steady, not with words, but with presence measured, patient, exact. In the end, it wasn't the building that mattered. It was the space they made inside it. A space held together by hands that knew how to bear weight without breaking. This is what quiet strength looks like. Not in speeches or medals, but in the decision to stay, to help, to make something hold, even when it doesn't feel like enough. If Reese's story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect or share your thoughts. And if you want more stories like hers, real, quiet, and enduring, we invite you to follow along.